I've lost count of the number of times people have asked me my opinion of knees over toes guy, Ben Patrick. So here it is. We are at polar opposites in our beliefs. I believe in partial range of motion, roughly 90 degrees, and he's perhaps the top advocate in the industry for promoting large range of motion to the point where he performs some jaw-dropping feats of mobility. With that said, he should be my arch nemesis. But I have to tell you guys, I agree with him. Many of our methods overlap. We've even discussed this on social media. So yes, we both believe in crushing the hamstrings and posterior chain, slow negatives, shin and dorsiflexion work, single leg movements, partial range of motion, sled pulls and pushes, hip flexor isolation, and even barefoot shoe training. I also consistently use several pieces of equipment he sent me that have been very useful, like the tib bar for the shins and the Nordic bench for the hamstrings and posterior chain. More importantly, Ben is a consummate professional in this field. He focuses on what he does rather than attacking other people in this industry, which I wish other experts and fitness influencers would do. But here's where we disagree. That is, what constitutes his optimal range of motion? So to better understand this, I want to go through a few of his videos so that you guys can understand some of our similarities and, more importantly, our differences. All right, so this first video is a collaboration he did with Mark Bell. Anyways, let's watch this.
I think everyone can do an ass to grass squat. So let's look at this. So we're talking that your hamstrings completely cover the calves without the heels lifting, without the back rounding, okay? What creates this? Okay, is that genetic? Is it? Well, I believe that there are two exercises that actually create this ability.
Okay, so first off, that's a very clean, deep ass to grass squat. Probably one of the best you'll see, especially in a barefoot shoe. You know, a lot of people, they'll rely on a weightlifting shoe with a heel raise to be able to reach that level of mobility. But I would also argue under these conditions, especially when you're using loads or you're doing something like a barbell squat, that you're simply hanging out passively on the tendons and ligaments. And one of the things that people in this industry who are advocates of squatting deep, one of their main points of rationale that they'll go to is they'll say, oh, in the research, you have to load the tendons and ligaments to really get them stronger. There's actually zero research suggesting that you have to isolate the tendons and ligaments in this fashion or just hang out on them and let the muscles kind of passively relax. There's zero research showing that that's necessary in order to strengthen the tendons and connective tissue. Technically, just a standard range of motion with the muscles functioning normally with heavy loads does a terrific job of strengthening the tendons and ligaments in and of itself. So let's keep this going.
Look at those two. Let's look at the first one, which is the ATG split squat. Now keep in mind, this is a long-term progression, but the weight is actually loading that front ankle. So this actually puts more load into that front ankle.
Okay, that's a crazy position right there that, again, I think he might be a bit of a genetic outlier myself. That's pretty incredible flexibility / mobility. I say flexibility because, again, this is somewhat passive. There's not a whole lot of co-contraction going on here. And with that said, I kind of want to dig a little bit into some of the science or my scientific rationale for why I'm not a huge fan of these positions. We look at things like the length tension relationship of sarcomeres or muscle fibers. It suggests that muscles have these full ranges that they function through in order to contract or fire optimally. Muscles don't like to be overly elongated. They don't like to be overly shortened. There's this optimal range where we have the most cross bridge attachments where those actin and myosin filaments, they attach to each other. We can create more tension, more force, handle greater loads, and we take more tension off of the connective tissue, even though we're still stressing them safely and biomechanically sound. So these positions right here, if we look at things like the length-tension relationship, this is way outside that optimal length for the muscles to function properly. So that means we have less motor unit recruitment and less muscle activation because of the reduced number of cross-bridge attachments. So, you know, it'd be one thing if going this deep led to more muscle activation, which could create more growth, but it doesn't. We actually have less muscle activation.
And then the seated good morning with the knees in front. Now notice here. I'm trying to keep my arch. Now I'm digging into pure glute stretch, abs.
Okay, if I got in that position, you'd have to take me to the hospital and unfold me, because there's no way I could get in there. Again, I think Ben Patrick is somewhat of a genetic outlier, if I had to guess, because most people, no matter how they train, they're probably not going to be able to get in this position. But if you notice something else here, besides the length-tension relationship and the biomechanics, look at the feet. They had to rotate out significantly, the hips and knees. There's no way to get into these extreme positions without sacrificing alignment. And when you don't have good alignment, where things are stacked, where the joints are stacked vertically, you lack joint centration. All that means is that you're placing undue stress on certain areas of the muscles or the joints, because the force is not equally dispersed across the working tissues. And again, that can spell disaster, kind of like a bridge where you have too much pressure on one area, not enough on another. Eventually, you're going to have structural breaches. So let's move on to some of the other videos here and see other exercises that he recommends. Okay, so this next video here is part of the collaboration with Mark Bell as well. I think he's going over the Nordic or reverse Nordic curl, and I'm just going to start it in the middle of the video.
Be walking like a newborn, like you don't realize, because we've never look how deep this is. This is like an 8-year-old like Swedish Olympic weightlifter or something. Yeah. So
something to point out here, this idea in the industry that we need to be squatting like we were when we were babies, or moving like we were when we were young kids, that's not optimal. When we were babies, first off, all of our bones hadn't fused yet. And also when we were kids, we didn't have high levels of motor control or stability or even good alignment. We were so loose and so flaccid and lacked motor control and stability. Like, why would we want to be moving like we were when we were little infants, where we had no semblance of motor control or stability? That is not the gold standard of movement. So again, doing things like we were when we were kids, I would argue that's not what we want to be doing. That's not how we want our bodies functioning as we go through the natural aging process. We want to be moving like we're 20 or 25 years old, not 2.
So this is an adaptation effect that every time I do this.
Again, if I got into this position, you'd have to take me to the hospital, because there's no way you're unfolding me from this, and I know things would break and tear. But again, this is somewhat contortionistic, at least I would argue that, and even resembles some pretty extreme yoga poses or yoga positions, which the literature shows can be problematic for a lot of individuals, and is actually more problematic for people who are most capable of getting into these positions, because these positions can produce such issues in the joints. They can lead to osteoarthritis. They can cause degradation of the cartilage. They can over-lengthen the tissues and the tendons and ligaments. So again, sometimes people's bodies who can't get into these extreme positions, those are the ones that are blessed, because their bodies won't let them get into these precarious positions to begin with. So let's just keep this going here. I want to see how he trains Mark Bell here.
Believe it or not, you'll be surprised to find that a lot of this stuff I actually like once a week.
Okay.
Now,
do you like the feet to be this way?
they're going to be this.
I don't want to keep stopping here. I want to let it flow a little bit more, but just to highlight this, the fact that he is able to achieve these types of adaptations and structural adaptations in his body with once a week, clearly he's a genetic outlier and probably has some level of hypermobility in his body, which again, the research shows we don't want that either. And people who are hypermobile, they do have some issues with their immune function and with other things physiologically. And the worst thing you can do is actually push those mobility boundaries, because it makes it worse. So I would argue, even if you can get in these positions, you probably wouldn't want to be. But most people, to get to these types of achievements in mobility, they're going to have to practice it daily, every day of the week. If you're getting there with one time a week, you probably are a genetic outlier.
They're going to be this way.
That way.
And right now, Mark's ankles might be on fire, but guess what? Again, he's actually loading. So right now, use your hands. Use your hands and yep, bend your hips. Yep, use your hands and just reach and try to think. But then it's almost like doing a natural leg extension. You see that? So out of the bottom, think with those VMOs. You see that?
It's super passive, but it is taking me to a position that I normally don't get to, you know, if I can.
Like you said, it's super passive. The muscles actually aren't really firing, so you're just stretching those connective tissues. But I would actually argue I'm not totally opposed to the position that Mark's in right here. So if people are doing some of these recommendations that Ben has on his workouts, and he's just saying, hey, just hold this position and you don't need to force it, I would say, hey, you're probably going to get some relief from this, especially for people who are sitting at a desk all day and their hip flexors and knees are super tight. Just getting into this position probably would be a quick win for helping to provide some relief and release some tension in those hips and knees. I would argue that doing something with some more active tension, like a 90-degree Bulgarian squat or 90-degree lunge, would actually be more effective. But I'm not totally opposed to this position right here. Let's keep moving on. There's a few more videos, and then there's some other key points that I want to just go over. Something else to keep in mind too is that when we look at studies on cartilage degeneration and things like the deep squat, there's a new kind of gold standard out there. It's called finite element analysis of movement. And this is one of the things that biomechanists are now looking at. And they've pretty much concluded in the research that deep squats are very risky for the knees, and they can lead to degeneration of the cartilage and osteoarthritis. In fact, one of the newest studies, I think it's by Carr and his colleagues in 2023, just a few quick highlights from that. I'm just going to read exactly what the authors themselves said. The cartilage of the knee are the most vulnerable to the development of osteoarthritis as a result of deep squatting. Increased stresses in the knee joint at deep squat posture may cause cartilage damage. A sustained deep squat posture should be avoided for healthy knee joints. So again, we can see this is kind of that new gold standard of how we look at cartilage health and joint health in the industry and in biomechanics, and it's suggesting that those deep positions are not ideal. But there is something else that I want to quickly point out before we move on here, is that I would argue that some of these positions that Ben Patrick gets into, like a deep squat, even though they can be problematic and using those positions too frequently can lead to osteoarthritis, that people who are healthy, individuals who have good muscle function, they should, in fact, be able to get into some of these positions like the deep squat, like that third world squat. We see people in Asia being able to do that. Again, it's not something that I would push, especially if it causes pain or if it's uncomfortable. But I would say that some of these positions are good indicators of mobility and muscle function, not good optimizers of muscle function. In other words, doing these positions too regularly will not help muscle function. It could make it worse. It could make the pain worse and lead to injuries, but they are probably decent indicators if you have healthy muscle function. But with that said, Ben claims that the Knees Over Toes program has also improved thousands of people's lives. You can see testimonials on the internet, just like you can see testimonials of people using the 90-degree program. So I want to address this and explain why I think his program does work. Right, so the first reason is that people just reduce the load or the total weight that they were working with. One of the big things that Ben is an advocate of is reducing the weight, using very light loads, even body weight for some of these exercises. So if someone goes from lifting 300, 400, 500 pounds to just 50-pound dumbbells or even body weight exercises, chances are their movement is going to improve and their joint health is going to be superior to what it was previously. The second point deals with cleaning up the ass to grass squat form, or that deep squat. When people start using the Knees Over Toes program, one of the things that they inevitably do is that they clean up their deep squat. Well, I can tell you from doing deep squats myself that a cleaner or more concise, crisp deep squat is going to be much healthier on the knees and joints than a lousy, sloppy deep squat. So again, if you're improving your deep squat quality, you're also going to see improvements in joint health. Ben is a big advocate of is not pushing through too much pain or discomfort. I think he usually says a 2 or a 3, which I also tend to agree with. So when people realize, hey, they shouldn't be pushing through pain or pain-like symptoms, again, they'll probably start seeing improvements in their body. And the last point, and I think this is the most important, is that it's somewhat of a mixed bag. If you do those various types of training we mentioned earlier, from the hip flexor work, the barefoot training, isolating the hamstrings, doing partials, slowing down the eccentric, working the shins, the tibias, what you're going to see is incredible improvements in your quality of movement, and your tissue and joint health is going to improve tremendously. But then you throw in a few negatives, like those deep positions or the positions where you're pushing your mobility and range of motion. You don't know what worked. It might be the hip flexor work, or it might be the hamstring isolation, or maybe it is the range of motion work. You just don't know. So this is one of the reasons I think his stuff works. It's because he includes things or elements that I also include in my program, and that really any successful strength coach also includes in their program. Contrast that to the 90-degree program or the 90-degree eccentric isometrics that I advocate. There has never been a scenario where someone has given it an honest try and has actually not only received incredible improvements, but there's never been a scenario where they've actually injured themselves or seen their pain get worse. They've always seen their pain get better. You'll never see a negative ramification from the 90-degree program. And we know it's the 90-degree principle that's the main variable or factor that's working or eliciting those improvements, because that's really the main thing that we're doing in our program. We don't have a lot of other variables we're using. We're not doing some corrective exercises over here or some mobility stretches over here. Everything's 90 degrees, so we know what was causing the improvement. It is those partial or optimal 90-degree positions. At this point, you're probably asking, what should you do? What would be my recommendation going forward? Well, I would try both programs. I would try the knees over toes program. I would also try my program. I would try them separately or individually so that you know which one works. But the main issue here, or the main point to consider, is that I always recommend people discover for themselves, that they experiment, that they kind of go on this journey of investigating what methods work, what methods don't, trying it for themselves, and keeping an open mind so that you're always willing to explore different variables and different types of training, because you don't know what works until you try it. So that's my biggest recommendation. Give them both a try. Hey guys, I'm excited to announce that my brand new book, Movement Redefined Fundamentals, is out, and it's completely free. It's on my website, advancedhumanperformance.com, and it gives all the details of the 90-degree eccentric isometrics protocol, and it just gives all the fundamentals that you need to maximize your strength training and gain as much muscle as possible, as well as optimizing your joint health. So check it out. Again, it's completely free.